Insomniacs Anonymous presents the creepiest true stories from the darkest corners of the web. Listener discretion is advised. A fork in the road. My girlfriend and I had driven down an old dirt road that ran beside a lake on one side, with mountains on the other. We were looking for an unexplored territory to hike in. The dirt road became a trail, and eventually was swallowed up entirely by the forest. Once the path had become impassable by car, we got out and hiked for quite some time, and began making our way back to the car as the sun was going down. It was slow going on the dirt road, and it was getting dark fast. Suddenly, we came to a fork in the path that hadn't been visible while we were coming the other way. Neither of us had any idea whether to go right or left, so I picked randomly, secretly hoping that both would end up taking us back to the main road. As we rounded a small curve in the road, the headlights fell upon a man dragging a large duffel bag off the trail into the woods. As soon as the lights hit him, he just froze completely still. Driving past him felt like an eternity because we couldn't have been doing more than 5 miles an hour due to the quality of the road. My girlfriend and I didn't say a word to each other until we were past him. At that point, we were like, "What the hell was that?" And then the road ended. Just like where we'd stopped the first time, the forest had swallowed up the part of the road. We were going to have to turn around and drive by the man with the human-sized duffel bag again. I told my girlfriend to buckle up and hold on tight because at the first sign of trouble, I was going to gun it. We came to the spot where the man was, but he was nowhere to be seen. We eventually made it to the right path and got the hell out of there. The strangest thing to me about all of this is that there wasn't a vehicle anywhere around this guy, probably for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen it if there had been. We'd traveled as far as possible both ways, and there just wasn't any place to pull a car off the road. How the hell did he get there? Where was he going? And what was in that human-sized duffel bag? The Ghillie Suit Man. I used to often spend my summers bouldering with friends by a relatively large forest that was about half an hour away from where I used to live. We used to spend some nights camping out there just to save travel costs and time. I think this was roughly the third or fourth time we were out there camping. My friend had left all her climbing gear and her rucksack just outside her tent, or we definitely think she did. The next morning we found her boots, some of her clothes, and all her chalk powder had disappeared. We figured that it could have been completely feasible that she misplaced it, although we were quite sure that they were next to her tent, and we really didn't want to believe they were stolen. We didn't read too much into this, and just stupidly said to ourselves that perhaps she'd left it by the boulders, and some animal took an interest to it. I know it sounds silly, but it was reasonable to us at the time, especially considering the alternatives. Fast forward a year, we're at the same spot as usual, sitting by the tents and chilling after having some food. Mind you, it's pitch black outside, and only the camp area is lit by fire. I went somewhere a bit out of sight to go to the toilet, and what do I see? A man in a full ghillie suit, laying on his stomach, looking right towards our camp. I stood there frozen as this dude clocks on that I've just seen him, and turns and bolts out of there. I don't know whether the event the year prior was related to the ghillie guy, but this has definitely stuck with us. We haven't been back there since, which is a damn shame. The crying in the woods. When I was younger and stupider and going to college in the North Georgia mountains, my friends and I would go hiking at night, a lot in the trails near campus. I got pretty familiar with the area and being out in the wilderness at night in general, which probably made me too confident. One night the full moon was out, the weather was perfect, visibility was crazy good. I was slightly stoned and feeling adventurous, and I love doing fun stuff alone, so I decided to enjoy a night hike by myself. I took a flashlight, but this was around 2002, so no phone. I chose a super easy trail that was mostly flat, maybe a mile loop, in a pretty secluded area. but not exactly a national park or anything, just a very rural area. I didn't even need my flashlight for most of it, and just hiked in the moonlight. It was actually a very cool, beautiful experience at first. At some point, I started feeling uneasy, and maybe a millisecond later, I heard a man's voice. It was coming from a good distance ahead of me, somewhere off in the woods, maybe from the right side of the trail. He was crying. I'm a pretty empathetic person. 99.9% of the time, if I hear someone crying, I'm going to go comfort them or check it out in some way. But this time, I felt sick to my stomach. I remember coming very close to calling out to him, because my brain was telling me that he might be hurt. But it was like my body shut down my voice before I could say anything, and I knew I had to stay very quiet. He was sobbing like he just found out a loved one had died, but also gibbering and almost babbling, like he was out of his mind. There was a shrillness to it under his crying, like he was holding back a scream, but perpetually, on and on, as if he'd been doing this all night. I remember it all so vividly. My spine is tingling like crazy right now recalling it. It's hard to explain, but I knew deep down he wasn't right in the head, and nothing good would happen if he realized I was close by. I turned around to go back the way I came. It was like I had tunnel hearing, and the only sound in the world I could hear was that crying. I was hyper-aware of everything else around me, and beyond paranoid that I would snap a branch or snag my boot on something. I just wanted the noise to stop, the crying to stop, to get far enough away so I couldn't hear it. Thankfully, it started to fade the further I got, and I made it back to my car. Still, I was convinced some wild-eyed hermit was going to rush out of the forest and bite me to death, right up to the second I locked my doors and got the hell out of there. I had the rest of my panic attack on the drive back. I managed to park back at campus, and I just sat in the car and collected myself. I have never felt a shred of guilt about leaving the guy alone in the woods. I know I was slightly stoned, but slightly is the key word here. I'm convinced to this day I was in very real danger that night. Sometimes I get that same sick feeling deep down whenever I wonder what might have happened if the moon had been less bright, or if I had been more responsible to check on him, or if I'd used my flashlight even once. He'd have seen me for sure. The Meteor Shower. One evening, my friends and I decided to hike to the top of a small mountain close by for a meteor shower. There were 4 of us, all around 16 at the time, and we thought it would be cool. We drove over and then started hiking. We took a break about halfway when we noticed there was a guy following us, in a business suit. We were weirded out, so we decided to start back up and walk a bit faster. But by the next time we stopped, he was only like 10 feet away, so we bit the bullet to see if he'd just walk by. He didn't. He stopped and asked us if we were there for the meteor shower, and if he could walk with us. We felt it was weird that a 30-year-old man, in a suit, wanted to hike with 16-year-olds, but we were polite. As we were walking, my friend and I noticed that the strange guy in the suit is walking really close to our friend, who is the only female in the group. I'm talking like he could smell her shampoo close. Eventually we got to the top of the mountain and sat down. He sat down almost right on top of our friend. With her reasonably freaked out, I made an excuse on why we had to leave early, and we promptly booked it out of there. We nearly ran the entire way back down the mountain. When we got back to the car, we thought, cool, we just ditched the weirdo. But no. When we were in the car, my friend pointed out that the guy is full-on sprinting down the trail towards our car with something that looked like a large stick. Being in our car, we just drove out of there very shook up. We chalked it up to some dude on some hell of a drug, but 2 days later we got a text linking us to a news report about a guy that had strangled his wife and then proceeded to kill another girl later that night on a hiking trail. I swear to you, it was the same guy. The same dude at the hiking trail. We never told our parents about that incident, and we never ever went back there. The body in the fridge. When I was very little, like 5 or 6, my dad used to take me on all sorts of adventures, especially at the time we owned a little cottage in the Scottish Highlands. Now, my dad is sort of a combo Irish bloke and Yorkshire laddie type. He's very spry, despite being about 55 at the time. On this particular occasion, he'd decided we were hiking way up into the cliffs. I was quite happy about this, as it meant a piggyback ride for at least 90% of the difficult parts. It turned out this was a proper trek. He wanted to get to one of the highest bluffs so we could have an amazing 360-degree view of all the gorgeous meadows and some sparkling sea. But after we reached the top plains, where it's all short, wind-swept grass and you can see for miles, he suddenly turned very still and very quiet. When you're 5 or 6, your parents seem like God, so seeing your dad look frightened is scarier than anything your own mind can come up with. So I was pulling on his arm and saying, "What? What is it?" My mum is epileptic and I saw her fit when I was a kid and I thought it was happening to him too, or something similar. And I wouldn't know what to do because we were out up on this huge cliff and no one is around to help. When just then, as fast as he started, he snapped out of it. He fireman lifted me right up and started striding away without a word. Over his shoulder I could see a big, yellow pale object stuck into the ground like an obelisk. I know now that it was a refrigerator. When I was older and I asked my dad about it, he stiffened up and told me that when he was a boy in the 50s, he and his friends had found an old-style fridge out in the woods, and being little boys, they opened it. Well, of course they found a body of another child, by whichever means had found themselves in the fridge and unable to get out. My dad never mentioned a gender, which leads me to believe he either came across a very decomposed body or skeleton. But I won't ask him. My dad has seen some pretty gnarly stuff in his time, but for whatever reason he will not discuss anything further about the child in the fridge. So when he explained, I assumed it was the trauma and I said something like, "Dad, that's awful. When you saw the fridge up there, it must have brought up those old memories." And he looked at me with his big blue eyes in a way I'll never forget. Hermits in the mountains. I went to this kind of outdoor education boarding school when I was 14 or 15 in the Victorian Alps in Australia. We hiked the mountains in that area almost every weekend, usually doing 2 or 3 night hikes. We had heard from teachers and locals that there were hermits in the mountains who lived in shacks, or drifted between the old cattleman huts. We just brushed them off as stupid stories. However, there was this one hike, at the tail end of winter, that kinda led me to believe that there were actual hermits living in the mountains. We were doing this 4-day hike at the end of winter, so it was super gloomy, foggy, and cold the entire hike. The Victorian Alps are famous for their cattlemen's huts, which are all over the high country. We would hike from hut to hut, but we rarely stayed in them because it was one of the school rules. So we were hiking on the second day on this steep ridge, and it was very foggy and cold. You couldn't see into the valley, only down the sloping edges of the ridge. When you're hiking long distances, you don't really talk the whole way, and since it was miserable, we all just had our heads down, walking in a straight line. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a black dog about 50 meters down the side of the ridge. It wasn't a dingo because it was jet black and it had a collar on. It looked a bit like a border collie. I'd only just registered that it was a dog in my mind when I swear I saw a man walking behind the dog. He looked homeless and was looking up at us. Bear in mind it was very foggy and the sky was darting in and out of trees. I turned around and told my mate I saw a dude and his dog on the trail below. He was still visible and I pointed him out. My mate freaked out a little and told everybody else to look. In the moment of getting my group, 6 of us, to stop hiking and look, he was gone. Everyone other than myself and my mate who saw him originally shrugged it off as a day hiker and his dog. We joked between ourselves that it was probably a hermit that we'd been warned about, but we didn't speak much about it after. We arrived at our campsite, which was called the Vallejo Gartner Hut. We couldn't stay in the hut, so we set up a camp on the flat grounds around it. We set up, cooked dinner, and got ready to go to sleep. I didn't think much about the man and the dog I saw earlier, but now it was getting cold and dark. It started to creep into my mind. There is this awesome toilet at this hut that overlooks the valley below. Honestly, one of the best toilet views you'd ever come across. It was getting quite dark, and I needed to go number 2, so I headed to the loo. As I was sitting there, enjoying the view, I started to feel a little creeped out. I didn't know why. One thing to note is that these huts are all covered in scribbles, graffiti including people's names and sayings. Literally every square inch is covered in something. Of course, you never really read anything on the walls if you stay at these huts every weekend. Though, as I reached out for the toilet paper, these words literally jumped right out at me. Run, 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 run. He's coming. Run. I've never wiped my butt faster. Combined with what I'd seen earlier that day, my creepy feeling, and what I just read, I bolted out of the bathroom back to my tent. The guy I was tenting with was actually the one who'd seen the guy earlier as well. I told him what I read in the bathroom. We both became pretty paranoid and just sort of laid there for hours, not making a sound, scared stiff. Eventually, we managed to fall asleep. Now, things get weird the next day. We woke up to find huge portions of our food missing. We kept all the food in the veranda part of our tents, in our hiking packs, and inside zipped bags. Half of my group's tent flies were undone, with the packs open and the food bags strewn all over the ground. We considered it may have been a wombat originally, but the bags were literally unzipped, not torn or scratched, and our hiking bags would have to be unbuckled to open them. My thinking was, the hermit guy we'd seen earlier followed us back to camp and raided our supplies. None of us slept well for the rest of that trip. Well, that's it for this episode. I look forward to your company next time.